In the winter of 1882, a lonely man's life is turned upside down when he finds a mother and daughter lost in the freezing woods. But this encounter will shatter more than just his heart. It will change his entire world. Curious where this journey will lead? Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you love these stories, and let's dive in. The winter of 1882 had settled like a heavy blanket over the northern timberlands, thick and unrelenting. The sun struggled to rise above the horizon, leaving the forest in a grey half-light that made shadows stretch long across the snow-packed ground. I had lived along this ridge for almost a decade, in a cabin I built with my own hands, timber and stone hauled through frost-bitten mornings. The winters here had never been forgiving, but this one had a cruel edge, biting at exposed skin and seeping into bones that had learned to ache with age. I moved slowly along the narrow trail that led to the creek, my mule plodding at my side. The snow had crusted into a brittle shell over the dirt, each step cracking underfoot. My coat was drawn tight, gloves tucked under my arms, and my breath formed white clouds that vanished into the still morning air. Since losing her 5 years ago, I had avoided the settlement, avoided people entirely. Towns were filled with noise, and with noise came expectations, obligations, losses. I had buried one life. I refused to risk another intrusion. Yet, as I rounded a bend near an old birch grove, something caught the corner of my eye. A figure lay slumped against a cluster of low shrubs, almost hidden by the frost-covered undergrowth. At first, I thought it might be a homeless man or a drunkard left behind by the night, but the shape shifted subtly as I approached. My stomach tightened. It was a woman, her body small and shivering, swathed in rags patched roughly with mismatched cloth. One arm clutched a bundle, the other hung uselessly at her side. Her hair, streaked with grey and tied with thin leather strips, had been loosened by the wind, framing a face that was drawn and weathered beyond its years. She did not speak or move as I crouched near her, assessing the damage that winter had inflicted. Her fingers were purple, swollen from frostbite, her lips cracked. Her cloak had been torn and crudely sewn back together, leaving gaping seams that let in the bitter cold. There were no weapons, no boots, nothing but her frailty and that small bundle. Instinct told me to walk on, to leave her to the forest, but her gaze found mine in a way that stopped me cold. It was not fear I saw there, not pleading, not begging, only quiet certainty, a strength I had not expected. I lifted the saddle blanket from Slate, my mule, and wrapped it around her shoulders. Careful, I hoisted her to her feet, noting how light she was, bones sharp beneath the tattered fabric. She did not resist. I walked beside her, one hand steadying her, the other holding the mule's reins. Snow crunched underfoot, the creek whispered in its frozen bed, and the wind carried a low, mournful whistle through the pines. The journey to the edge of my property was slow. She stumbled once, and I steadied her under the elbow. She pressed against me only briefly, then lifted herself upright, moving with the rhythm of someone who had learned to survive by self-reliance. As we crested the last hill before my clearing, the small settlement of abandoned cabins and a shuttered trading post came into view. Not much of a town, more of a place where hope seemed to have left years ago. She did not speak. The quiet weighed, but I did not fill it. My own voice had grown foreign to me over the years, words left unused in the cold silence of my cabin. Yet in that silence, I began to think of the questions I could not ask. Who were they? Where were they going? Why had they been left to wander alone in the snow? My chest tightened at the thought of bringing more responsibility into my life, yet something unspoken tethered me to this fragile woman, an obligation that existed outside of pity or duty. We reached the cabin, and I guided her inside. The warmth hit her immediately, and she exhaled slowly as if inhaling the first breath of safety she had known in days. I set her bundle aside and studied her cautiously. There was dignity in the way she accepted the quiet, her resilience not diminished by exhaustion. She knelt near the fire, drawing the heat to her shivering body, and I moved to stoke the flames further, the soft crackle filling the room where once only silence had lived. I ladled out what remained of my morning stew, rabbit, carrots, and barley, and placed bowls before her. She ate slowly, carefully, her eyes cast downward but vigilant, measuring each bite as if preserving not just food but control. For hours we remained in silence. I watched her, noting the rhythm of her breathing, the way her shoulders eased as she allowed the warmth to seep into her bones. In all my years of solitude, I had never experienced such quiet trust, a bond formed not through words but necessity, survival, and a tentative recognition of shared humanity. By the time night fell, she had not asked for anything else. She settled near the hearth on the thin mattress I had laid out, the fire flickering against her pale, frost-bitten skin. I watched the steady rise and fall of her chest, and knew something fundamental had shifted. The solitude I had clung to for so long was no longer mine alone. A weight of responsibility settled in my chest, not unwelcome, not expected, but undeniably present. And in that still, cold cabin, I realized that the winter of 1882 had brought more than frost and snow. It had brought a reckoning with myself, a confrontation with the emptiness that I had carried like a shield. And it had brought them. The wind had sharpened overnight, carving icy ribbons along the branches of the dense forest. The first light of morning caught on the frost, scattering shards of sunlight across the ground like scattered diamonds. I trudged through the snow-covered trail, each step heavy, boots crunching against the frozen earth. My breath formed clouds that lingered before dissolving into the cold, still air. Slate, my mule, followed behind, his hooves leaving prints that were quickly swallowed by the drifting powder. I was used to the cold. Winters in these woods had always been bitter, but this one carried a weight beyond frost. It carried memories, echoes of the past I thought I had buried along with Elizabeth. I didn't notice it at first, didn't realize how empty the cabin had felt these last 5 winters. But then, the sight of her, an old woman, fragile, curled around a tattered bundle, and her daughter, hesitant but fierce, changed something in me I hadn't expected. I had wrapped the blanket around the woman's shoulders and helped her rise, guiding her toward my cabin. The cold seemed to cling to her bones, gnawing at her like it had gnawed at so many before her. She didn't speak, and I didn't try to force words. Silence was safer. I had learned long ago that people revealed themselves when they were ready. She let me help her. Her daughter followed, watching me with wary eyes, like someone accustomed to being unseen, or perhaps someone who knew that being noticed was dangerous. I wondered about her, about the life she had led before we met on that frozen trail, but questions stayed lodged in my chest. I didn't ask. I only guided, steadying her when her steps faltered, feeling her weight press lightly against the blanket I had draped around her. It wasn't mine to rush. The walk back to the cabin was quiet. The snow muffled all other sound, making the distant call of a crow or the creak of a tree seem louder than it should. I kept my pace steady, measured, my thoughts occupied with routine, yet now tinged with unease. My cabin had always been mine alone, a sanctuary built from stone and timber, sweat and backache. Its walls were solid, and its hearth reliable. I hadn't realized how much I relied on the quiet until now. The presence of another person, even two, was a strange weight, a vibration I couldn't ignore. When we finally reached the ridge, the cabin sat before us, squat and plain, smoke curling from the chimney. The old woman leaned on Slate, her thin frame supported by his patient body. The younger girl followed silently, eyes forward, cautious. They entered first, and I stepped behind, letting the warmth hit me. The fire still smouldered, embers faintly glowing, and the scent of charred wood and smoke filled the room. My coat hung damp from the snow, and I realized I was staring at them too long, trying to read what neither offered. I moved to ladle out what little stew I had left. Rabbit, carrots, and barley. They ate without speaking, the old woman slow and dignified, the girl fast but careful, like hunger was a threat she had learned to contain. I watched, noting how she moved, how her hands trembled slightly from cold, how her eyes darted occasionally toward the window, alert to a world I had chosen to block out. She had scars of her own, invisible yet present, etched into the way she carried herself. As the days passed, the cabin seemed to shift subtly. The silence, which had been my companion for so long, now held a new dimension. It was layered, filled with the careful breathing of two people who had survived more than I could measure. I began to notice their routines, their resilience, the little rituals that spoke louder than words ever could. The younger girl, Sona, would gather firewood before dawn, her hands raw from frost, and I watched her fingers curl around branches as if she was squeezing the world into her grasp. The old woman, Oda, remained frail but resolute, moving with careful deliberation, her eyes scanning the room as if it were a map she had memorized in some prior life. I didn't know how to speak to them. Words had failed me before, and I had no practice in offering comfort to someone I hadn't lost yet. So I did what I could, chopped wood, tended traps, repaired fences, and allowed them space. Trust, I knew, wasn't demanded. It was earned, and every glance, every step, every shared silence was a small deposit in the invisible bank we were all building. Night fell early. The wind screamed against the cabin walls, rattling the shutters and throwing the snow against the roof. I sat near the hearth, boots on, hands clenched, watching Sona drape her thin coat closer around Oda. There was care in her movements, precise, unspoken. She didn't speak of her past, of why they were cast out, of what the world had done to her. And I didn't ask. I watched, and in watching, I began to understand. She had survived by hiding, by enduring, by learning to carry more than her fair share. And here, in this cabin, she was letting herself be seen. That night, I lay in my bed, listening. The fire crackled low, embers dancing, shadows flickering against the walls. I heard Sona shift beside her mother, soft breaths, the subtle creak of old joints. Responsibility had settled over me, thick and stubborn. It wasn't the desire to save or possess. It was the slow recognition that life had handed me more than emptiness now. I had been alone, yes, but now I wasn't. And the weight of it, strange as it felt, was not unpleasant. It was alive. The next morning, I woke to faint light and the scent of wood smoke. The air was frigid, frost still clinging stubbornly to the edges of the windows. Sona stirred, moving quietly to tend to Oda. I dressed slowly, aware of the sound of her hands, the careful motion she took, the way she avoided disturbing the fragile peace of the cabin. I fed the chickens, checked on Slate, split more wood. She followed, silent but present, and I realized that this was the beginning of a rhythm, a shared existence that neither of us had asked for, yet both of us needed. It was the kind of trust that didn't announce itself, that crept into the spaces between words, in the quiet moments before speech or movement. And in that silence, I began to feel a warmth I hadn't known since Elizabeth, a weight in my chest that wasn't grief, but something gentler, steadier, alive. The days blurred together as winter pressed on, relentless and white. I found a rhythm in the cabin that I hadn't known I craved. Mornings began with the sound of frost cracking beneath our boots, the sharp smell of cold air filling our lungs. Sona was steady in her movements now, no longer the wary girl who had flinched at every sound. She had begun to claim her space quietly, arranging small personal items around the cabin, stacking herbs and dried meats with a precision that suggested both care and caution. Oda remained still mostly, moving with deliberate grace, as though every motion counted twice as much in her frail body. I watched them from the corner of my eye more than I realized. My own habits, once solitary and methodical, now included this constant, careful observation. I chopped wood differently, ensuring the pile was neat and easily accessible. I filled the water barrels earlier, anticipating their needs without a word. The presence of these two women had introduced subtle anxiety and anticipation into every task I undertook. It was exhausting, yet there was a strange satisfaction in it. For the first time in years, the silence of my cabin wasn't oppressive. It was shared. But the world outside remained indifferent to our fragile cocoon. Tracks in the snow hinted at life. Other humans, perhaps hunters or travelers, or worse. The forest itself seemed sharper, the wind carrying whispers that unsettled even Slate, who had grown used to my routines and the rhythms of this isolated land. I taught Sona how to watch for danger subtly, how to notice shifts in the snow, in the air, in the birds overhead. She absorbed it quickly, her eyes sharp and calculating, betraying the survival instinct that had carried her this far. She asked few questions, only mirrored my movements, slowly sinking with my experience. One morning, after a night of bitter winds that rattled the shutters and shook the roof, I noticed Sona standing outside, surveying the ridge. Her breath formed clouds that twisted in the wind. I approached quietly, not wanting to startle her. She didn't turn. "There's something," she said finally, voice low, almost swallowed by the gusts. "Tracks. Not fresh, but someone's coming." I studied the faint impressions in the snow, considering her words. She was right. The prints were too deliberate to be random travelers, booted, deep, purposeful. Whoever had passed this way was strong and moving with intention. I felt the old tension coil in my chest, the kind I had felt many winters ago when the world outside was no longer predictable. We returned to the cabin cautiously, securing shutters and reinforcing doors. Oda watched silently, eyes narrowed, but offered no words. The fear wasn't just in us. It hovered in the corners, carried in the hush of the air, in the sudden pause of Slate's movements. Sona moved to the window, peeking through the small crack between wood and frost, while I checked the trapline, ensuring our means of warning or escape were ready. For a few hours, the cabin held. We moved quietly, coexisting without the need for speech. Meal times were subdued, small and functional. I noticed Sona's hands shaking slightly as she served Oda, the tension manifesting in small, human ways. I placed my hand lightly on hers, an instinctive gesture, and she didn't pull away. That small connection, the weight of human contact in a frozen world, was as vital as the fire we stoked every morning. That night, the wind brought more than frost. Through the cracks, I could hear the distant howl of wolves, or perhaps men, carrying torches. The fire struggled against the draft, flickering, casting long, wavering shadows across the cabin walls. I slept lightly, ears straining, mind pacing the possibilities. Sona stayed near Oda, blankets drawn tightly around both of them, a small fortress of shared warmth against the chill of the unknown. The next day was quieter. We repaired a fence broken by the snow, and I taught Sona how to use the rifle more effectively, adjusting her stance, demonstrating careful aim and breath control. She learned quickly, muscles coiling with the right balance of tension and release. The practice was both mundane and essential. In this land, survival was an apprenticeship, one that demanded your full attention. Afternoons became moments of reflection. I found myself asking questions aloud, sometimes to Slate, sometimes to no one at all, testing the waters of conversation. Sona listened more than she spoke, but gradually, fragments of her past emerged. Stories of small victories, of harsh winters survived, of towns abandoned, of people lost. Each detail painted a picture of resilience and determination, a quiet fire burning beneath her wary exterior. And yet, despite these fragile bonds, The threat outside never fully receded. Tracks grew fresher. Smoke appeared on the horizon in the distance, thin ribbons that could have been from anyone. The forest seemed to breathe differently, heavier, like it knew something unseen was moving closer. I kept the cabin ready for a rapid exit, trapping doors, securing windows, hiding supplies, preparing for confrontation. It was during one such moment that I realized the strange comfort this shared vigilance had brought. We were no longer just occupants of a cabin in the wilderness. We were a small, interdependent unit, defined by survival, trust, and mutual observation. Otter, Sona, and I, our fates intertwined in the quiet but unyielding embrace of the forest. And as night fell, I watched the shadows stretch across the cabin, feeling for the first time that the world outside might be approaching, but we were ready. Not just ready to survive, but ready to confront the life that had brought us here, to face the unknown as more than just individuals. Together, we formed a small bulwark, fragile yet stubborn against the cold, against the threat, against the silence that had once been my only companion. The fire burned low, embers glowing faintly, and I knew that the coming days would demand everything we had: vigilance, courage, trust, and perhaps even sacrifice. And in that quiet determination, I felt something stirring, something that had not existed in me for years. A spark of hope, a flicker that maybe, just maybe, we could endure what the forest and the world beyond would throw at us. Winter had tightened its grip, wrapping the forest in ice and silence. Each day, the cold gnawed a little more at our fingers, at our resolve, yet we carried on. Sona and Otter had become more than companions. They were extensions of my senses, my instincts, my defenses. Each morning, we moved with precision, checking traps, inspecting the perimeter, and cataloguing every new track in the snow. That morning, the tracks were unmistakable. Fresh, heavy boot marks, deliberately avoiding the markers I had left along the edge of the clearing. Whoever was out there knew the land. They knew the snow. They were calculating, patient, and purposeful. I felt that old, familiar surge of adrenaline, the kind that sharpens senses and compresses time. It was survival, plain and simple. And we were far from powerless. Sona and I followed the tracks, Slate padding silently beside us. Otter remained in the cabin, tending to the fire and keeping our food stores ready, her hands steady despite the anxiety that I knew must be gnawing at her. We moved like shadows, careful to leave no traces, circling through the thinning pines. The tracks led us past familiar landmarks, across frozen streams that cracked underfoot, and into a hollow where the wind whistled through dead branches. It was here we found the first evidence of intrusion: scattered supplies, a broken sled, footprints leading deeper into the forest. Sona crouched low, examining the disturbed snow. Her eyes were sharp, scanning for even the smallest clue, and I realized with a quiet admiration how much she had changed. Once cautious and reserved, she now moved with a mixture of confidence and instinctual caution that rivaled my own. "They're setting a trap," I murmured, voice low so the forest would not hear. Sona's nod was the only response needed. Together we retraced our steps, examining the spacing of footprints, estimating weight, and considering intent. Whoever had passed through had not wanted us to follow, yet they had left signs, deliberate, almost taunting. It was psychological warfare, a message embedded in the snow. We were being watched. By the time we returned to the cabin, dusk had fallen, and the cold pressed against the wooden walls. Otter had prepared a meager meal, her movements deliberate and soothing, an anchor against the unease that threatened to unravel our focus. We ate quietly, eyes scanning the horizon through narrow window slits, ears straining for the slightest disruption in the night sounds. As darkness fully descended, a shadow appeared at the tree line, a flicker of movement that made Slate growl low in his throat. Sona moved to the window silently, peering through the frost. I joined her, hands gripping the edge of the sill, and we saw them. Figures, hunched against the cold, moving deliberately, a small group no larger than 5. Their presence confirmed my suspicions. They were trackers, skilled in the ways of the forest. The wind carried their voices faintly, words indistinct but laden with intent. I could sense the calculation behind each step they took. These weren't random trespassers. They had a purpose, and it was directed at us. My mind raced, formulating plans, contingencies, strategies. We were cornered in more ways than one, by the wilderness, by the cold, and now by the intelligence of those moving against us. That night, sleep was impossible. I kept watch in turns with Sona, the two of us listening for any sign of approach, the flicker of a torch, the crack of a branch underfoot. Oda remained between us, her presence both comforting and grounding, a reminder that we were not alone in this fight. The wind carried whispers of movement, the forest breathing around us, and I realized that the line between hunter and hunted had blurred. By dawn, the trackers had made their presence undeniable. Supplies were missing, traps had been disarmed or circumvented, and messages carved into the bark of trees warned us to leave. Whoever they were patient, skilled, and relentless. It became clear that confrontation was inevitable. We spent the day preparing. Barricades were reinforced, escape routes mapped, and weapons readied. Sona practiced her aim with a rifle, Oda checking the condition of knives and makeshift spears, and I studied every possible approach the trackers could take. We moved as one unit now, a small, silent force shaped by necessity, each of us aware that failure was not an option. The first attack came just as the last light of day faded. Shadows emerged from the tree line, figures moving with deadly precision. Slate's growls cut through the still air as the first man reached the outer perimeter. We responded instinctively. Rifles fired, knives found their marks, and the forest erupted into chaos. Sona moved beside me, her aim true, her movements fluid. Oda, despite her frail frame, fought with a courage born of survival, turning her small size into an advantage, striking from hidden angles. Hours passed like minutes. The cold bit at our fingers, sweat ran beneath heavy clothing, and the shouts of attackers echoed through the hollow. Yet we held. Each intruder forced back, each advance repelled, and slowly, the forest fell silent again, save for our ragged breaths and the crackle of the fire that had somehow survived the chaos. As we surveyed the aftermath, the realization struck. We were stronger together than I had ever imagined. This cabin, once a refuge of isolation, had become a fortress of unity, forged in fire, snow, and blood. And though the night would bring new challenges, one thing was clear. We would not be intimidated, we would not be broken. I looked at Sona and Oda, both exhausted but resolute, and I felt something I had not in years: certainty. Whatever came next, we would face it together. The forest could roar, the cold could bite, the world could press upon us from every direction, yet we had become more than mere survivors. We were a unit, a small, indomitable force against the encroaching wilderness and whatever human threats dared enter our domain. That night, as snow fell softly outside, blanketing the chaos in white, I realized that the true strength of this place was not in the wood and stone of the cabin, but in the bond we had forged within it. And for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to hope, not just for survival, but for victory, for life, and for the possibility that we could endure what the winter, the forest, and the people who lurked beyond it would bring. The forest held its breath. After the previous night's ambush, a tense silence had settled over the cabin. The snow outside was pristine again, masking the scars of battle beneath a deceptive layer of calm. But inside, the air was charged with unease. None of us slept well. Every creak of the cabin, every shifting shadow, carried the weight of anticipation. By morning, the evidence of our attackers' resilience was everywhere. Tracks circled the cabin, some partially erased, others deliberately misleading. They weren't just hunting us. They were learning, adapting, calculating. It became clear that our survival depended not only on our skill, but on our ability to think one step ahead. I convened with Sona and Oda in the small kitchen, the cold making our breath visible in the dim morning light. Slate lay at my feet, ears twitching, sensing the tension. "They're not going to stop," I said, voice low but firm. "Tonight, they'll try again. And they'll be more organized, more prepared. We need to be ready, not just to defend, but to anticipate." Sona's eyes, normally calm and calculating, flickered with a mix of fear and determination. "We can't just sit here," she said. "They're testing us, learning from us. If we stay reactive, we'll lose. We need to strike first." Oda, her hands gripping a kettle, stared at the floor, a shadow of doubt crossing her face. "Strike first, how? We don't even know how many there are. If we make a mistake, we—" I held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "We're not reckless. But we've survived this long because we're smart. And because we work together. We need a plan that gives us the advantage. Visibility, mobility, and control. That means using the terrain, the forest, and every resource we have. Tonight, we don't just defend, we hunt." The day passed slowly, each hour heavy with the weight of preparation. We set traps far from the cabin, using sharpened stakes hidden beneath snowdrifts, tripwires strung between trees, and decoy paths leading away from our position. Sona checked and double-checked the rifle, adjusting for the bitter wind that would affect aim. Oda reinforced the cabin, boarding windows, and securing the small entrance with heavy timber. As night fell, the forest seemed to close in. Shadows deepened, the wind whispering through the trees like a warning. We moved into position before the first star appeared, hearts beating in measured rhythm, senses straining for the slightest anomaly. Slate, restless yet controlled, patrolled the perimeter with a silent vigilance that was almost supernatural. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Then the sound came, a faint crunch in the snow, a whisper of movement. I froze, signaling Sona and Oda to their positions. The attackers were close, careful, coordinated. I realized with a sinking certainty that we were no longer dealing with opportunists. These were trained hunters, professionals who had spent weeks preparing for this encounter, just as we had. The first wave of figures emerged from the trees, their movements precise, their faces obscured by scarves and shadows. We held our fire, waiting for the perfect moment. Then, as one, they triggered the first trap, a tripwire that sent a weighted log crashing down, knocking two intruders off balance. The fight was on. Gunfire split the night, echoing through the hollow with a sharp, metallic roar. Sona's rifle sang with deadly precision, each shot calculated, deliberate. Oda moved like a shadow, striking from concealment, using her small size to navigate the terrain unnoticed. Slate leapt and lunged, teeth and claws a whirlwind of defense, his growls blending with the chaos. But the attackers were relentless. They adapted, flanking us, probing for weaknesses, exploiting any lapse in our focus. One man breached the outer barricade, forcing me into close combat. I felt the cold bite of metal against my gloves as I deflected his knife, countering with a swift strike that sent him sprawling into the snow. Adrenaline burned, senses sharpening to near-painful clarity. Amid the chaos, Sona signaled a new approach, leading a group into a concealed path I hadn't noticed before. I followed, and together, we managed to push the attackers back toward the frozen creek, where hidden ice traps had been prepared. Men slipped, fell, and were immobilized, their momentum turned against them by our careful planning. Even as we fought, exhaustion began to gnaw at us. Each movement demanded more effort, each breath came heavier in the icy air. And yet, we pressed on, driven by survival, necessity, and a stubborn refusal to be overrun. The forest, once a silent observer, now roared with our struggle, bearing witness to the battle for dominion in its shadowed depths. By dawn, the attackers had retreated, or what remained of them. The forest was eerily silent once more, broken only by the shallow breaths of the three of us and the soft padding of Slate's paws in the snow. The night had been brutal, testing our skills, our endurance, and our unity. But we had survived. And in surviving, we had discovered something vital. We were stronger than we had realized, each of us a crucial part of a single, unyielding force. Yet, in the quiet aftermath, I understood that this was only the beginning. Whoever these people were, they would return. More organized, more prepared, and more dangerous. The forest had become our battlefield, our prison, and our shield. And within it, we would be forced to confront not only the threats beyond the trees, but the doubts and fears that whispered within ourselves. That morning, as sunlight pierced the canopy and touched the snow in golden streaks, I made a silent vow. No matter the cost, no matter the danger, we would endure. We would fight, we would adapt, and we would survive. For now, the forest was ours. And for the first time, I felt a flicker of hope. Not naive, not fleeting, but a steady flame that might just carry us through the trials yet to come. The morning after the battle felt surreal. The forest was deceptively calm, sunlight glinting off the frost-encrusted branches, birds chirping as if unaware of the violent struggle that had raged just hours earlier. Yet, beneath the serenity, tension simmered. Every sound, an animal's rustle, a distant snapping branch, could signify a returning enemy. We surveyed the aftermath. Broken weapons, footprints frozen in the snow, and the occasional muffled groan of the wounded reminded us that the fight had not been without cost. Oda examined the cabin, her hands trembling slightly despite the harshness she tried to mask. Sona walked the perimeter, scanning the horizon with a rifle slung over her shoulder, eyes narrowed and calculating. I moved silently among the trees, Slate close at my heels, analyzing the tracks left behind by our attackers. Something was off. Too many discrepancies in the patterns, too many false trails. It was no longer just a pursuit, it was a psychological game. Whoever these people were, they were intelligent, methodical, and frighteningly patient. "You think they'll come back?" Oda asked, her voice breaking the silence. She avoided my eyes, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her fear. "They will," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "And when they do, we need to be ready, not just physically, but mentally. Every trap, every strategy we've prepared, they will test it. They'll push us to the edge. And if we falter even slightly..." My words hung in the cold air, unfinished yet full of implication. Sona finally spoke, her voice sharp and deliberate. "Then we need to anticipate them before they act. Waiting for them to move first will cost us dearly. We need to understand their motives, their methods, and most importantly, we need to identify their leader. Every coordinated attack has one. If we can neutralize them, the rest will falter." The tension in the group was palpable. Each of us understood the stakes, yet the burden weighed differently on each heart. Slate padded around us, sensing the unease, occasionally stopping to growl softly, warning of movements invisible to human eyes. We spent the day fortifying our defenses, but the task felt increasingly futile. Every barricade erected, every trap set, seemed like a temporary solution against an adaptable enemy. I began mapping the surrounding forest in my mind, memorizing every ridge, every shallow ditch, every cluster of trees that could serve as cover or a choke point. Survival depended on more than reaction. It required anticipation, strategy, and courage. As dusk approached, a strange sensation crept over me. The hairs on the back of my neck rose. Something in the forest felt alive, observing, patient. The previous night's attackers weren't just humans. They were instruments of chaos, testing boundaries, studying our reactions, and learning. I could feel it in the way shadows clung to the trees, how the wind carried whispers I couldn't quite hear. Suddenly, a distant howl echoed through the forest. Not animal, I realized, but human, or something orchestrated by human intent. Sona immediately raised her rifle, scanning the tree line. Oda reached for a hidden blade in her coat, eyes wide and alert. I crouched low, signaling Slate to stay close. Every muscle tensed, ready for movement, for flight, or for confrontation. Then the first of them appeared. Not from the trees, but from within the shadows of the snow-covered clearing. They moved silently, almost ghost-like, their faces hidden beneath scarves and hoods. The numbers were greater than last night, more coordinated. The sense of threat escalated instantly. My stomach tightened as adrenaline surged, sharpening every sense. The attack began with precision unlike anything we had faced. Arrows whispered through the air, narrowly missing Sona as she dived behind a tree. One man lunged from the right flank, only to be thrown backward by Slate's sudden strike. Oda moved like liquid shadow, her blade slicing through the chaos, but even her speed wasn't enough to fend off all the simultaneous threats. It became clear. We were being tested not just in strength or skill, but in endurance, unity, and psychological resilience. Their tactics forced us to split focus, protect the cabin, protect each other, anticipate every move. And then, a thought struck me with chilling clarity. These attackers weren't just after us. They were after something else. Something beyond survival. Something we didn't yet understand. Hours passed in a blur of snow, steel, and gunfire. By midnight, both sides were exhausted, yet neither willing to relent. The forest was a chaotic ballet of life and death, each movement deliberate, each decision potentially fatal. Slate, relentless and ferocious, became our anchor, his growls guiding us through the fog of combat. Finally, in a fleeting moment of lull, Sona and I exchanged a glance. Her eyes reflected both exhaustion and determination. "We can't just wait anymore," she whispered. "We need to find their base, their leader. Otherwise, this will never end." The realization struck us with brutal clarity. Survival was no longer enough. We needed to take the fight to them. Only by confronting the source of the chaos could we hope to end it. And in that moment, I felt the weight of leadership settle fully upon me. Not just to survive, but to plan, to act, and to protect the fragile spark of hope that still burned within us. As the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I made a silent vow. We would track them, uncover their secrets, and confront the darkness that pursued us. But we would not falter. We would endure. And we would emerge stronger, if we survived the trials ahead. The forest watched, silent and eternal, as we prepared to step into the unknown, aware that the coming days would test us in ways we could not yet imagine. The hunters were now becoming the hunted, and the game had only just begun. The forest had changed overnight, or perhaps it was us who had changed. Every branch, every mound of snow seemed sharper, more deliberate. The events of the previous day weighed heavily on our shoulders, adrenaline still thrumming in our veins, eyes constantly scanning the shadows for signs of the enemy. Sleep had been a luxury, one we had barely afforded ourselves, yet the drive to press on burned hotter than exhaustion. We moved cautiously, like predators navigating a labyrinth of frost and trees. Slate padded silently beside me, ears twitching at every snap of ice or rustle of leaves. Oda kept her hand on her blade, fingers knuckles white with tension. Sona was silent, a rare and telling sign. She usually spoke even when she didn't need to, but now her quiet suggested the gravity of our situation had finally settled into her mind. "The patterns last night," I began, keeping my voice low. "They weren't random. They were designed to test us, to figure out our weaknesses." Otter nodded slowly. "And we showed them more than they expected. But we also learned more than they anticipated. They'll adapt. We need to adapt faster." Sona finally spoke, her tone sharper than the crisp morning air. "Then we stop reacting. We take the initiative. Every step they expect us to take, we'll take one they don't. If they want to play a game of anticipation, let's change the rules." It was easier said than done. Every ridge and hollow of the forest had already become a mental map, every tree a potential ally or enemy. Yet, I realized, our survival depended not just on skill but on understanding the psychology of those who hunted us. They were intelligent, patient, and frighteningly coordinated. But even the most methodical strategy falters if met with unpredictability. By noon, we had devised a plan. We would split, not entirely, but enough to cover ground and flush them out. I would take Slate and scout the northern ridge, following trails and noting every anomaly. Otter and Sona would approach from the south, setting traps, drawing attention, and keeping them off balance. The idea was risky. Coordination would be difficult, and any mistake could be fatal. Yet, the tension of inaction was more dangerous than the risk of engagement. The forest seemed to pulse with life, or perhaps with anticipation. Shadows shifted unnaturally as the wind picked up, carrying whispers we couldn't interpret. Every sound, footsteps, distant call of a bird, the crunch of frozen undergrowth, seemed amplified, weighted with significance. Slate growled low, and I knew instinctively that we were being watched, that our movements were being anticipated even now. Hours passed in tense silence. Tracking our enemies proved frustrating. They were meticulous, leaving only fragments of clues, never enough to be certain. Yet in the gaps between footprints and broken twigs, patterns emerged, an intentional asymmetry in their paths, subtle manipulations of the environment. Whoever they were, they had been planning this long before we even entered the forest. Then, without warning, a scream pierced the air, raw, human, desperate. I froze mid-step, Slate's fur bristling as the sound echoed. It came from the southern approach. My heart thudded. Otter and Sona. Instinct took over. I sprinted through the trees, Slate at my side, senses acutely tuned. Branches clawed at our clothes, snow burned our lungs, but we didn't slow. When we arrived, the scene was chaotic. The attackers had divided their focus, striking with precision. Arrows flew, barely missing Sona as she dove behind a fallen log. Otter's blade moved with lethal grace, yet even her speed couldn't counter the relentless pressure of numbers. We were being tested again, pushed to our absolute limits. I leapt into the fray, Slate's jaws clamping down on an attacker's arm, yanking him off balance. Otter spun, slashing another, while Sona used the chaos to flank and drive a wedge into their formation. Snow sprayed with every movement, footprints smeared with blood and mud, a battlefield frozen in time yet alive with violence. In that moment, clarity struck me. We weren't just fighting for survival. Each encounter, each test, was designed to shape us, to mold us into something stronger, something capable of confronting the unseen leader orchestrating the chaos. And yet, with every victory came the sobering awareness that the endgame was still out of reach, that the true threat had yet to reveal itself fully. As twilight approached, the forest's shadows lengthened, stretching like dark fingers across the ground. We regrouped briefly, panting, wounds raw, eyes scanning for signs of further attack. Slate nudged my hand, ears perked. He sensed movement beyond human perception, an approaching presence that chilled even my hardened nerves. Then I saw it. A figure, just beyond the tree line, observing us. Not attacking, just watching. tall, imposing, and deliberate in movement, cloaked in shadows that seemed almost unnatural. The leader. I could feel their intelligence radiating through the air, a calculated, cold menace that promised greater trials ahead. "They've been waiting for this moment," Sona said softly, her voice tinged with awe and fear. "Everything we've faced, it's been leading to them." The reality sank in with a weight that pinned us to the frozen ground. The confrontation we had prepared for, feared, and perhaps even hoped for was imminent. The enemy had revealed their hand, and the true challenge, the one that would determine everything, was about to begin. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the wind ceasing, the birds silenced, as if nature itself acknowledged the impending storm. We stood, hearts pounding, senses sharp, aware that the next few hours could change everything. And deep within, a spark of defiance ignited. We would not yield. We would face this leader, uncover their motives, and survive, not just to endure, but to triumph. As the night closed in, shadows danced and merged, hinting at the confrontation that would define the remainder of our journey. Every choice, every movement, every heartbeat mattered, and as we prepared to step forward, I knew one undeniable truth. The forest had witnessed countless struggles, yet none like the one about to unfold. We were ready, or as ready as anyone could be when standing on the threshold of the unknown. Night had fallen with an almost theatrical precision. The moon, a thin crescent, cast ghostly light across the snow-laden forest, illuminating every branch, every jagged stone. The cold bit deeper now, not just at fingers and toes, but at the marrow itself, seeping into bones and nerves. Silence dominated, but it was the kind of silence that screamed, laden with anticipation, with unspoken threats. The forest had become both ally and trap, and we were acutely aware of the shifting power in the air. Slate's low growl broke the stillness, and I followed his gaze. There, at the edge of the clearing, the figure lingered, seemingly unmoved by the biting wind or the terrain. Every instinct told me this was no ordinary adversary. Their presence carried weight, authority, and an almost tangible intelligence. The way they watched, deliberately yet casually, suggested a predator accustomed to being observed and obeyed without question. Oda tightened her grip on her blade. "They're testing us again," she muttered, her voice a harsh whisper, blending with the wind. "Every movement we make, they anticipate. We need to force them into action." Sona's eyes narrowed, a flicker of both fear and resolve passing through her expression. "Force them, yes, but not blindly. They've anticipated our reactions so far. Every trap, every feint, they've turned it against us. We need to think beyond combat." I considered their words, weighing the possibilities. The enemy leader, if that's what they were, had orchestrated every trial with meticulous attention. Their goal was not merely to defeat us physically. They wanted to shape us, to push us to the edge of mental and emotional endurance, perhaps even to break us. Our plan, hastily formulated but necessary, was simple in concept and dangerous in execution. Oda and Sona would lure part of the enemy force into a controlled skirmish near the ridge, creating chaos, exploiting every natural obstacle. Meanwhile, Slate and I would flank the leader directly, using stealth and deception to close the distance without alerting the entire contingent. If executed correctly, we could finally force a direct confrontation with a figure who had been orchestrating every hardship we'd endured. We moved as shadows, each step calculated, each sound carefully muted. The snow crunched softly beneath our boots, masking our scent and presence as much as possible. The forest seemed to pulse with energy, every tree a sentinel, every gust of wind carrying the subtle scent of impending conflict. Hours passed in near silence, broken only by distant shouts, clashing metal, and the occasional bark or howl from a corner of the forest. Oda's voice finally pierced through the tension via hand signals and gestures. She had successfully drawn part of the enemy contingent into our trap, their movements predictable yet deliberate. The skirmish was a controlled chaos, a dance of blades and arrows, snow splattered with blood and ice alike. Finally, the moment arrived. Slate and I approached the leader, creeping through the underbrush, every muscle tense, every sense heightened. Their figure remained calm, almost regal, an unwavering force against the frantic energy surrounding them. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of metal, smoke, and earth. I could feel the weight of the confrontation pressing against me. And then it began. The leader moved with a fluid grace, almost imperceptible. One moment they were shadows at the edge of my vision, the next a blur, striking with precision. Slate lunged, teeth bared, and the figure responded with an elegance that was terrifying in its efficiency. Every strike we made was parried, every attempt to close distance anticipated. The forest became a theater of war, branches snapping, snow spraying, and the cold air filled with the sound of battle. Oda and Sona joined the fray, emerging from the shadows like specters, their presence both a relief and an added complication. The battlefield became a choreography of survival, every movement critical. Yet, despite the ferocity of our assault, the leader remained a step ahead, calm, calculating, almost impervious. It was then, amidst the chaos, that I saw the first crack, not in their armor, not in their stance, but in their demeanor. A subtle hesitation, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even curiosity. Our unpredictability, the way we adapted and countered, was beginning to matter. We were no longer just reacting. We were innovating, improvising, challenging the authority that had seemed absolute. "Focus on disruption," Sona shouted, her voice cutting through the din. "Break their rhythm. Force them to make mistakes." Oda adjusted her stance, moving like a shadow, blades flashing in the moonlight. Every feint, every decoy, every carefully calculated movement began to create openings. The leader, despite their skill, could no longer anticipate everything. Every second gained felt like a victory, every successful strike a tiny liberation. Minutes stretched into hours, though it felt like mere moments. The forest around us had become almost alien, transformed into a living battlefield where every tree, every shadow, every gust of wind played a role. And then, in a moment of chaotic brilliance, we combined forces. Oda's strike distracted, Sona's maneuver drew attention, Slate lunged, and I found the opening, a vulnerability just beneath their guard. The leader faltered, just slightly, enough for us to capitalize. My blade found its mark, a precise strike that cut through both armor and illusion. The figure staggered, eyes widening in a mixture of surprise and realization. The battle was far from over, but the momentum had shifted. For the first time, I saw doubt reflected in their eyes. For the first time, the orchestrator of our trials felt uncertainty. It was a fleeting moment, a whisper of possibility, but it was enough. Enough to signal that our relentless pursuit, our resilience, and our unity could challenge even the most formidable adversary. As the night deepened, the forest seemed to exhale, holding its breath with us. The path ahead remained uncertain, fraught with danger, but one truth crystallized in my mind. We had crossed a threshold. The final confrontation, the resolution that had seemed impossible, was no longer beyond reach. And in that quiet, fleeting moment amidst the chaos, I realized that survival was no longer enough. We were not merely enduring the trials. They were forging us into something greater, something capable of shaping our own destiny. The enemy leader would not surrender, nor would they relent easily. But neither would we. And as dawn threatened to break across the horizon, painting the forest in muted gold, I felt the inexorable pull of what was to come. The final chapters of this story, where every choice, every strike, and every breath would define the end. The forest, now bathed in the pale light of early dawn, felt strangely still. Snow, once disturbed by the chaos of battle, now lay in uneven drifts, broken branches jutting out like skeletal fingers. Slate padded cautiously ahead, ears pricked, as if sensing more than the eyes could see. Oda and Sona moved beside me, their breaths visible, shallow and rapid. The enemy leader had staggered, yes, but their presence still loomed over us, a silent threat, like a shadow refusing to yield to light. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being drawn into something larger than the forest, larger than any fight we had faced before. Every step seemed guided by an invisible hand, every sound magnified. And then we saw it, a clearing unlike any other, surrounded by towering, frost-coated pines, with the ground undisturbed except for a single set of footprints leading to the center. The enemy leader stood there, arms folded, the faintest smile playing on their lips. "You've come far," the voice echoed, low and deliberate, carrying both approval and warning. "But the end is not yet yours to claim." Oda's eyes narrowed. "We don't intend to leave without answers. Why all this? Why the trials?" The leader's gaze swept over us, piercing yet calm. The trials were never about survival alone. They were about understanding limits, fear, loyalty, and courage. You've all faced yourselves in ways few ever will. Only now do you begin to see the purpose behind it all. Sona shifted, her grip tightening around her weapon. And what happens when this understanding is complete? What is your goal here? A long pause, then a soft chuckle. My goal is simple, yet profound. To awaken. To reveal what lies dormant within each of you. Some fear what they will find. Others embrace it. You, the leader stepped closer, snow crunching under their boots, have chosen to embrace it. I felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. The words weren't threats, yet they carried a weight heavier than any weapon. This was the moment the forest had been leading us to, not merely a battle, but a revelation, a truth hidden beneath layers of fear, struggle, and the relentless cold. Slate growled low, sensing tension as if the leader's aura alone could be measured in threat. But the flicker of doubt I had seen before in the leader's eyes returned. Our persistence, our unity, had begun to challenge them not just physically, but mentally. For the first time, I saw that victory was within reach. Not merely survival, but understanding, clarity, and perhaps freedom from the trials that had defined our existence. The final confrontation was imminent. The air itself seemed to thrum with anticipation, and I knew that what came next would not only define our fates, but also reveal the true purpose behind every trial, every shadow, and every moment of fear we had endured. The clearing felt alive, though eerily quiet. Each breath came in clouds of frost, mingling with the tension hanging thick between us and the leader. Slate's growl echoed softly, a reminder that instincts rarely lie. The leader stepped forward, each movement deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if the forest itself had conspired to place us here. "You've endured much," the voice said, calm yet commanding. "But endurance alone is not enough. To triumph, you must face what you fear most. And for each of you, that fear is different." Oda's hands shook slightly. What do you mean?" The leader's gaze shifted to her, and suddenly, the snow seemed to swirl, rising into shapes and figures from her past, memories she had tried to bury. Her father's disapproving look, the night she failed to save someone she loved, every shadowed regret laid bare. Her breath caught, and I stepped closer, instinctively placing a hand on her shoulder. Sona stiffened, and the leader's attention turned to her. Shadows of doubt, betrayal, and unspoken guilt danced around her like living phantoms. She fought to remain steady, but the whispers of her own mind were deafening. I braced myself, knowing it was only a matter of time before my turn came. The leader's eyes met mine, and suddenly the forest was empty, save for me. My greatest fear manifested, not enemies or monsters, but failure. The fear of not being enough, of letting everyone down. My hands shook, heart racing, yet I forced myself to step forward. "You see," the leader said, voice softening, "these trials were never meant to break you. They were meant to awaken you, to make you understand your own strength, your own resilience. Everything you have endured, every fear you have faced, has led to this moment." The snow lifted, revealing the forest as it truly was, not a place of punishment, but a place of transformation. The leader extended a hand, not in threat, but in invitation. "Step forward. Accept what you are. Accept what you've become." We stood together, hearts pounding, and for the first time, the fear that had gripped us began to loosen. There was no enemy here, not in the usual sense, but a reflection of ourselves, a test of courage, trust, and unity. And in that moment, I realized that victory was not in defeating someone else, but in confronting the truths we had all carried silently for so long. The forest seemed to exhale around us, the snow settling into quiet patterns, as if time itself paused to witness what was about to unfold. We stepped forward together, no longer separate individuals weighed down by fear, but a single force bound by shared trials and understanding. The leader's eyes held a mixture of pride and something almost human, compassion. "You have faced what you feared," the leader said, voice echoing softly through the trees. "Now, you must decide what you will do with this knowledge, this power. Will you let it define you, or will you use it to shape the world?" Oda's gaze met mine. For a moment, words failed her, but then a soft, determined smile spread across her face. "We'll shape it," she whispered, voice steady. Sona nodded beside her, her own fear replaced with clarity. Even Slate, usually so wary, let out a low, approving growl. The shadows of our pasts dissolved into the air, replaced by visions of possibility. The mistakes we had made, the moments of hesitation, the failures, they were no longer chains but lessons, engraved into our very being. The forest shimmered with an ethereal light, revealing a path leading out, not toward escape, but toward purpose. We stepped forward, each footfall a declaration. The leader raised a hand, and a surge of energy coursed through the clearing, not as punishment, but as recognition. "You are no longer defined by fear. You are the architects of your destiny." And as we emerged from the forest, the winter sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the landscape. Every scar, every battle, every tear had led to this moment of profound clarity. We had endured, we had grown, and above all, we had chosen not just to survive, but to live fully, with courage, empathy, and unwavering resolve. Looking at each other, I realized that the journey was never about defeating an external enemy. It was about confronting ourselves, understanding our fears, and embracing the strength we had within. And in that understanding, we discovered a freedom more profound than any victory we could have imagined. The forest behind us faded into memory, but the lessons it had imparted would forever shape the paths we walked from that day forward. And as we ventured into the unknown, hearts aligned, spirits unbroken, we knew one undeniable truth. Together, there was nothing we could not face. If you were in his shoes, would you have fought the same battle? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, and explore the other stories waiting for you on screen.